You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends, LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle and me at leadersandlegends.net. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Brad Tolinski. He's the former editor-in-chief of Guitar World magazine. He is a prolific author. He was on the podcast just a few months ago discussing his book, Eruption, about the career of Eddie Van Halen. I sent him a note afterward thanking him for coming on that podcast. And it was a terrific discussion, especially for someone like me who grew up with Van Halen's music. I noticed in doing my research that he wrote a book on Jimmy Page, and it's called Light and Shade, and it is terrific. I asked him to come back on, and he has consented. Brad, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, Robert. Pleasure to be back.
The book we're discussing today is called Light and Shade, Conversations with Jimmy Page. And if you don't want to take my word for it, that it's absolutely wonderful, how about this guy? Quote, "This is the most comprehensive and compelling collection of interviews, insights, and historical anecdotes of one of rock and roll's premier guitarists, songwriters, and producers ever compiled. A fascinating must-have for Jimmy Page fans like myself." That's from Slash. Brad, you outdid yourself with this book. It is a time warp. It is fascinating. It's funny. It's somewhat irreverent in some spots. So informative. Let's jump right into it. I want to talk to you a little bit, maybe some general topics before we get into specific parts of the book. But when did you first meet Jimmy Page? What comes through in this book is maybe it's a journalistic friendship, but there's clearly a friendship between you and Mr. Page. How did that form?
Well, I was the editor-in-chief of Guitar World, and like probably many of you out there, and you, Robert, one of my favorite bands of all time is Led Zeppelin, and one of my favorite players was Jimmy Page. And Jimmy had just sort of come out of a long period of inactivity and did a record with David Coverdale. I guess this is back in the late 80s, early 90s. I forget the year. And we arranged to do a cover story on him, on Jimmy for Guitar World. And when it came time to assign who would do the story, that's the perks of being the editor-in-chief. Yourself to the stories that you would like to do, and it was very, very exciting for me to speak with Jimmy. He was one of the major influences on me as a guitar player, one of the big three, certainly when I was growing up, the other being Clapton and Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page, of course. So I prepared like a madman for this interview because
I'm familiar.
I also heard that Jimmy could be difficult. So I had really, really prepared for it. And I spent most of the time, out of respect to him, talking about the new record and not Led Zeppelin. And he took a shine to me for both of those reasons. I was very prepared. I could talk with him about guitar playing, about production, all those kinds of things. And I didn't make the conversation about Led Zeppelin. I made it about his current project, which is what he was interested in at the moment. And so we struck up a sort of a friendship. And around that time, they also were releasing these sort of Led Zeppelin greatest hits packages. And so I had a chance to speak with Jimmy again, and this time about Led Zeppelin. And he just let me at it. I mean, it was incredible. I mean, I think the first couple times we talked, they were like 3-4 hour long marathons. And he sort of expressed that he enjoyed talking about it because I was, focusing on how great the music, and questions about that.
He seems to be among the surviving band members, and correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think I'm overstating this, but it's possible. He seems to be the most proud of what took place under Zeppelin when Zeppelin was going. Is that fair to say? I mean, he was I've watched some documentaries, and one of the things that comes through in all the documentaries is that Page is the driving force behind Zeppelin.
He was the driving force. He always was, though. I mean, so it's no surprise. He basically put the band together. He found all the people, including the manager, and he produced all the records. It was essentially, the band was initially very much his vision of what he wanted music to be and what he wanted to sound like. And he went about very meticulously finding the people that could produce that idea, So it's always been his baby to some degree.
But Page was somebody, for lack of a better term, before Zeppelin. Yeah. What was his reputation and notoriety before he formed this band?
Well, Jimmy had an incredible career before Led Zeppelin. As a teenager, he played in local London bands and was very well regarded in that circuit. And one day, a record producer saw him play and said, "Hey, this is, I would say, in the early 60s, 63, 64, 65, around the time when the Beatles were just sort of going." And they were like, "We need some young kid to do session work to make these, help us with these rock and roll records, So he had been having health issues and wanted to get out of the club circuit anyways, and thought, hey, it would be really cool to be a session musician. And he went on to play on, at one time it was estimated something like 60% of the records that came out of England.
And he played for if you read through your book and some other articles, the Stones. I think I read where he played like maybe a lick or a part of a Hard Day's Night or something for the Beatles. Like these aren't just like microwave commercials he's playing for. These are big artists, big songs.
Yeah, no, the Who, the Kinks, them, which was Van Morrison's first band. He played on the song Goldfinger, from James Bond theme, and just a lot of stuff that was coming out of England at the time. There were basically two session guys, and one was Jim Sullivan and one was Jimmy Page. And they called Jim Sullivan Big Jim, and they called Jimmy Page Little Jim. But Jimmy wasn't really that little. I mean, he's a good 6 foot tall. So, I think it was just more that he was more of the junior status. He came second. So, anyways, he had an unbelievable career as a session musician. But then he saw all of his friends, like getting screamed at by girls and having fun out on the road. So he decided he wanted to play in in a band and got the opportunity to join Jeff Beck and the Yardbirds. And you know, the Yardbirds are not so famous these days. I mean, they've been lost a little bit in time, but the records were really cool and innovative. And Jimmy played on the very last Yardbirds record.
Well, I was going to ask you that because that comes through in your book. You chronicle that period really well.
Yeah.
How did Page describe his time as a member of the Yardbirds?
Well, the thing is, what Jimmy basically's main point was there couldn't have been Led Zeppelin without his work in the studio because of all the different things and the different styles he learned while being a studio musician. And then he got a good solid couple of years out on the road with the Yardbirds and learned about, you know, the American market and traveling and playing in bands. So it was this great education, what he saw it as the thing that you know, most young players don't get these days, that kind of experience before they start their bands, right? Yeah. So everybody wonders why the first Led Zeppelin record sounds so great. Well, gee, by the time Led Zeppelin recorded their first record, Jimmy had been an experienced studio guy, had experience producing records, and had plenty of time playing live in front of audiences.
How was Page's playing and writing actually influenced by American blues? And how did he turn it into rock's most powerful sound?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, you know, people talk about the blues element, and that was a big deal in Led Zeppelin's sound. But really, the Led Zeppelin sound is made up of three components. And it's the blues is one of them. But the other thing was Jimmy's was also very, very interested in British folk as well. And you hear that coming through on, you know, songs like Stairway to Heaven, most famously, and all the acoustic music on Led Zeppelin 3. But it was also influenced by, you know, East Indian music and, you know, in some ways, songs like, you know, Kashmir or the Eastern influence sounds of Black Mountain Side. I mean, it's some of the first examples of world music, you know, of like music from other cultures being blended in with rock music. So the blues were very important to Jimmy. I mean, it gave him like a lot of the ideas for his solo electric guitar stuff, but it was these other influences that really made, I think, Led Zeppelin something special, much less, you know, more than having one dimension than, say, you know, just if they were a blues band, a boogie band, or a heavy metal band or something.
Like on Led Zeppelin 4, you have Going to California, and then is it Going to California followed by Four Sticks, or Four Sticks followed by Going to California, where you're like, if you listen to them back to back, you wonder if they were the same band. But if you knew Led Zeppelin songs and the musicianship, you're completely convinced they were the same band.
Yeah. I mean, that was something that Jimmy was, you know, most guys, a lot of rock guys will say, it just sort of happened, you know, oh yeah, you know, we were just messing around. But Jimmy was never like that. I mean, he's always methodical in what he does. And you can see the building blocks from the first record to the very last, incorporating all these different, you know, unusual elements into that blues rock sound.
And that's one of the things that comes through really strongly in your book. We're talking to Brad Tolinski, author of Light and Shade, Conversations with Jimmy Page. And it seems to me, and in contrast, I'm only going to reference this a few times, but to the Van Halen book that you wrote that we discussed a few weeks ago, mm-hmm. is that it seems like that Page's career was really one layer on top of another. I did this, and now I'm going to do this plus this, and then I'm going to add another element to it. And the next question I want to ask you is kind of along that theme. How critical to his career success and that of his bands was Jimmy's abilities as a producer?
It was crucial. But it wasn't just self-indulgence. I mean, as it turns out, Jimmy Page ends up being one of the greatest producers of all time. Without getting too nerdy about it, probably the way Jimmy recorded or had John Bonham's drum kit recorded, the sound of the drums from Led Zeppelin 1 on is probably one of the most influential things any band has done in the 20th and 21st century. Like, what happened was Jimmy took that drum sound and made it much bigger than they usually were on records and placed it right up front with the rest of the instruments. That's his idea. That's not something that happened from accident. That's part of his production idea. The idea of getting a singer who sings high so that the voice is out of the way of those drums and the guitars, so that it comes across and hits you in a certain way. A lot of those are production ideas. And if the band had been produced by anybody else, it just wouldn't have sounded like they did. Let me give you an example. Try to give you an example. So Mickey Most was a big British producer, and he was the guy that produced the Yardbirds record that Jimmy Page played on. And Jimmy and him fought the whole time about, how the band should sound and how the band should be. And the Little Games record, which is the record that Jimmy plays on, it's just got so much goofy, weird stuff on it, And Mickey Most was a very effective producer at the time, but Page had this other idea way beyond everybody else, as to the way the band should sound. And so it was crucial that he was in charge so that he could deliver that sound. It wouldn't have happened any other way.
This is a quote I had for a question later on in the interview, but I can't resist it. When asked about forming his band, Jimmy Page said that he wanted a powerful drum sound, and then said, quote, "But Bonham was beyond the realms of anything I could have possibly imagined."
Yeah. It's a once in a lifetime drummer.
And it would have taken someone like Bonham to impress Page, because he was a session musician. He had been around all these musicians. He had done his band, he had done his touring. And doesn't it show, is that probably the most significant evidence that Bonham changed rock and roll sound, not just drum sound?
Yeah, no, obviously drummers don't get quite the attention that guitar players get because they're they're behind the scenes. But I mean, that was sort of the wonderful thing about, just going back about the music of the 60s and the 70s. Before everything became computerized and put on a grid, all the musicians had personalities and contributed to the sound. You couldn't have had The Who without Keith Moon. No way.
Right.
The Who, you couldn't have had Yes without Bill Bruford playing the drums. I mean, he is such a distinctive approach. And the same thing with John Bonham. I mean, his ideas, say on a song like Four Sticks or Kashmir. I mean, you can't imagine it. You can't imagine any other drummer playing on those tracks or coming up with those ideas.
Going back to some general questions, I have pulled us forward because I had to get that quote in because I read it multiple times and just thought, wow, what an amazing compliment about Bonham. But something that you detail in your book is Jimmy Page's association and or fascination with the occult. Mm-hmm. How did that affect him or influence him as a musician or as a rock and roll personality?
It's a super complex question. And I won't go into too much crazy detail about it, but I did try to present it in a way in the book that people would understand its importance to Jimmy, and it wasn't just sort of a flaky. He wasn't a dilettante about it, you know. I mean, he really believed in, or does still to, believe in the, mystical powers. And Jimmy would call it comparative religions. It's a form. It was a form of spirituality to him, and everybody always talks about Aleister Crowley, who is the most notorious of all the occult figures, and try to link it with Jimmy Page and it being this sort of dark thing. But Jimmy wasn't just into Crowley; he was into all sorts of, metaphysical literature, and and reading history and on religion and on philosophy. He did believe that, music had mystical powers and influences, and I don't think it's necessarily, the devil or something like that. We're just talking about, sort of the wonderful power that it has to music has to work on us in all sorts of different kinds of levels. And I think that Jimmy was interested in that. But he wasn't interested in it in sort of a goofy way. It was very serious. He was very well read on the subject matter. I know quite a bit about that stuff myself. So that was another way we were able to, communicate to each other.
There were accusations, which seemed odd, maybe. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's the only word I can think of at the moment, that some of Led Zeppelin's tragedies and problems in the latter half of the 70s were related to Page's dabbling in the occult. That sounds so crazy that I guess it could only be a 1970s theory. But what do you make of that criticism? Is it just jealousy or people looking for headlines? As I read it in your book, and I've obviously heard about it before, I just was like, okay, so you actually think that Robert Plant's son died because Jimmy Page wore pants with a dragon on them?
Yeah. Well, that stuff like that always sort of comes out of ignorance. I would probably say their problems came more out of the influence of cocaine and heroin than it did.
Well, you anticipated my next question, so go right ahead.
Well, there's a lot of stuff going on in the 70s that felt very normal back then, that right now everybody looks at as excessive. But if you were in the rock world in the 1970s, there were two things that A, you probably doing cocaine, and B, you probably believed that it was harmless, because back then people really didn't know about it. They thought it was a non-addictive drug, and it made you feel like a giant among men. And if you're a giant among men to begin with, and you feel even gianter because you've just done a bunch of blow.
Musicians had dealers who traveled the world with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like their connection or whatever was with them at all times, just in case.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked to Jimmy about it, I and go into great detail, but he said, it was part of the culture. It was part of the, what was going on at the times. And, people just didn't know as much about the effects of any of this stuff, or the, the psychological effects or physical effects. And drugs make you do weird things, make you do things that you probably if he thought twice about, you wouldn't have, So that probably had more to do with the Led Zeppelin falling apart than any of Jimmy's occult interests.
The saying is sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and it seems that Jimmy Page did all three with abandon.
Yeah, and you would have too if you were there.
Right before this podcast, all three. Like so many others in the rock and roll world, it seems that many of them abandon their formal kind of education, as we would take as public school education, to concentrate on being a musician. How helpful was it for these musicians and Page to accelerate their career by focusing on one thing, one goal?
Well, that's sort of an interesting question. Not to be contradictory, but it's probably a little less applicable to Zeppelin because Jimmy actually went back to college while he was doing session work, and John Paul Jones was pretty educated, and probably John Bonham was the only one that was super working class, and it was either focus on music or becoming a bricklayer. And I think John probably would have been, his father was in construction. I think he would have been happy to be a bricklayer as well. But, for a lot of people, it's like, they'll focus on their music because that's really what it is that they want to do. And I don't see why that should be considered any better, any worse than getting an education in school. I mean, it's a different sort of education. I've had, good friends of mine have gotten pretty successful right out of, high school and got into bands. And they ended up traveling the world and doing all sorts of fantastic things that they would have never had a chance to do had they gone to school and not become a musician. It's just tricky to maintain that as a living. You have to be very lucky.
We're going to dive into the Led Zeppelin part of the podcast in considerable detail for the next several questions, but I want to ask you a question that you asked in your book. So in one of your interlude interviews, which I want to ask you about, in Light and Shade, one of your interviews is with Led Zeppelin publicist Danny Goldberg.
Oh, yeah.
In which you asked him the question I'm about to ask you.
Yeah.
What do you think makes this band so great, and why do we still care?
I think I spend most of the book trying to answer that question. It's not a hard question to answer, in a very flip manner, very light manner. Well, you get four great musicians together and, you get them dedicated to a cause and Jimmy Page is one of a kind. And, you can go and say all of that stuff, but we've talked a bit about just a small amount of the things that really made the band different and exceptional. And one is, you take Jimmy Page and he had all this incredible experience, in the recording studio as a studio musician, and a lot of experience playing the United States and playing on big stages with the Yardbirds. And he walks into the band with this already in his back pocket. Now, there's very few rock bands that have that opportunity. Next you have John Paul Jones, who is also an incredible studio musician, had played with hundreds of bands, but not only that, but a schooled musician and a schooled arranger. He used to do orchestral arrangements and so on and so forth for a bunch of different rock people during that era. And you had those two guys with that sort of intelligence, knowing what they want to do, when they saw Robert Plant and John Bonham, they could figure it out. So, a lot of rock bands start, a lot of them, 90% of them probably just start with random kids that are pulled together that come from a neighborhood,
Right.
and so they'll have their own little skill levels and stuff like that. But by the time Led Zeppelin started, they already had this huge, leap ahead of everybody. They had a level of sophistication that a lot of people don't have. And then you just have, Page, who is a brilliant musician and composer,
So let me ask you, why do we still care?
Because it's good. There's so few things in the world that are genuinely, unarguably good. and you can quibble with this or that, but when you listen to Led Zeppelin 4, Stairway to Heaven, something like that, it's undeniable. But I think maybe part of the reason it was able to hang in there for so long and why we still care is because, to get back to a point that I made earlier, Jimmy was so ahead of his time in terms of recording and production. So, again, his recordings of John Bonham's drum sound, for example, are still being sampled and used in hip hop and all over the place these days. The records still hold up. They still sound modern. They don't sound like, I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles, something different. Not to knock that. I mean, I Want to Hold Your Hand.
Or punk. Punk or disco or those sorts of things, or like sometimes you can hear a song on 80s on 8 on XM and you're like, oh my God, that sounds like 1985 all over the place.
And I think that it's funny, the music has roots in folk, but the cover of Led Zeppelin 4 shows a knockdown sort of wall, sort of a older world wall, and in the background the city of a modern urban landscape. And so it had this combination of the future of the past, and what you end up is something that's timeless. And so you respond to it. It's like saying, well, why do people still care about this Bach guy or this Beethoven guy? Because what they did was undeniable, and it had legs. It was interesting enough to take you into the future as well as the past.
And they made that comment. I think this is in your book, where they bridged the 60s and the 70s, the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, and they were intentional about that, creating a new sound. Go ahead, Brad.
Yeah, a new sound that we're still coming to grips with today.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana. I'm sure loving sponsoring this Led Zeppelin podcast, the Girl Scouts of Central Indiana. God love them.
Page would certainly like it.
Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today is Brad Tolinski, author of Light and Shade, Conversations with Jimmy Page. I read this book. I could barely put it down. It is a time warp, not only to the 70s, but also to an era beyond the 70s, because the book doesn't just chronicle Led Zeppelin, but Jimmy Page's entire career. It's beautifully written and wonderfully arranged, much like Led Zeppelin songs itself. And if you do not believe me, then perhaps you'll believe this fella who says, Light and Shade illuminates the haunted genius of Jimmy Page in an original and completely satisfying way. The conversational dynamic between the author and the subject reveals a wealth of info about the man, the music, and the magic. That's from Kirk Hammett of Metallica. Brad, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be back here chatting with you guys.
Led Zeppelin 1 is widely considered the greatest debut album of all time. Rick Beato, I'm sure you're familiar with, just ranked it number one on his list. Where would you rank it? And what was the album's impact?
Led Zeppelin 1?
Yes, sir. He had that as the greatest debut album. Number 2 was Boston. Number 3 was Van Halen 1. I think 4 was Jimi Hendrix, but I'm not sure. But he had Led Zeppelin 1 as the greatest debut album of all time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely one of the greats. I don't know, I mean, like when you have, I still feel like the Beatles, Meet the Beatles is still probably of more consequence, probably culturally and historically. But Led Zeppelin 1 is, I could see Rick. See, Rick is a music nerd, for those of you who don't know who Rick Beato is.
And Rick Beato has agreed to come on the podcast. I took a flyer, invited him. He's busy for the spring, but I'm going to reach out to him in April at his request. And Brad, I hate to say this, I dropped your name immediately in the email to ask Rick to come on the podcast. So I hope that was okay.
That's fine. But Rick is a total music hound, a super instrumental music guy. And I think what he was getting at there is, again, sort of what we've just been talking about, is that as a debut, it changed a lot of things. It changed the way people approached recording the guitar, approached the way people recorded the drums. And I think it also showed how many different directions that single rock band could, what they could do on one record. It didn't have to be about one sound. It could be about many, many different things. But I think sonically it's probably could be argued the first really sort of 21st century record, the first really modern sounding record, because of the approach that Jimmy took to recording all the instruments.
I was just going to question along those lines. It seemed that Page had, and this is discussed in your interviews with him, that's part of your book, that he had a strategic plan that was far beyond just the recording of one album.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, how detailed that plan was, I don't know, but he had a general idea of what he wanted to do with the band, recording wise and sonically. And then each record is sort of an exploration of that. I guess getting back to your, other point, Robert, don't get, everybody out there. I mean, believe me, I am a huge, huge Led Zeppelin fan. I mean, I worked on this book with Jimmy for close to 20 years. There's about 20 years of interviews that we did over a long period of time. I love the band. But I do think maybe the thing that held Zeppelin back, holds Led Zeppelin 1 back just a bit from being regarded as the greatest debut, is it took a longer time for Robert to figure out what he was doing in terms of lyrics. Like lyrically, it's a lot of there's not a lot of substance there. It's mostly like recycled ideas from blues songs and things like that,
And doesn't Jimmy talk about that in your interviews with him? How Robert Plant grew as a lyricist through the career?
Absolutely. Musically, Led Zeppelin 1 is, like I said, it's sort of unapproachable, unassailable, But lyrically, I think that it holds it back a little bit from having as much cultural significance as it could have. If I'm going to be maybe overly intellectual about that.
Is it, I was born in 1967.
Yeah.
I have 3 older siblings. I think they're about your age. They're born in 58, 59, and 60. And so I was lucky enough to be introduced to Led Zeppelin at a very young age, but I was too young to comprehend how enormous the Led Zeppelin phenomenon was. Please describe as best you can to the Leaders and Legends podcast audience the incredibly massive juggernaut that was Led Zeppelin in the 1970s.
Well, they were just fantastic on every level. I mean, and really, I mean, fantastic. They were almost like a a fantasy object. They were almost like a Disney special or something like that in a weird way. I mean, I grew up in a small Midwestern town, you know, in Taylor, Michigan, in Detroit area of Michigan. And I don't know, you know, like I was in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it was just the sticks. It was like, you know, you had your Kmart over here, you had your little suburban town over here. And then all of a sudden, Led Zeppelin comes out with these weird records of like that summon up like medieval times and you know, the sort of darkest Chicago blues and you know, all of these super psychedelic sounds and everything like that. And when you're a kid in the middle of nowhere and this thing is dropped upon you, and it's done by real people, not like fiction, you know, it's not like a movie. It's like real people actually producing this stuff. Yeah, that's entertainment for hours. I'm sorry. That's back when there's only 3 channels on television.
Don't scare our audience.
No. Yeah, exactly. But it's that's why it's sort of hard to explain. It's really like if you could imagine, you know, the horse and buggy period, all of a sudden a flying saucer.
Well, and you think about it,
Led Zeppelin was like something from outer space, you know.
But pre-internet, pre-YouTube, pre all this stuff that you and I and a lot of people listening can still remember. The debut or the dropping of a Led Zeppelin album was an event.
Yeah.
Like, do you remember thinking or like, oh my God, Led Zeppelin's got an album coming out and I can't wait to get it. And then you get it and the album is called Physical Graffiti and you listen to the entirety of a double album and you're like, this is everything I was waiting for and more. Do you remember that anticipation as a fan?
Well, yeah, I mean, my favorite record, and it may be my favorite Zeppelin record, is actually House is the Holy. And it came out on my birthday. So I was like, whoa, that's great. But also, you know, I mean, especially for us, like I'm a guitar player. So these records would come out and it wouldn't only be just great to listen to, but you'd also be sitting there like, what is the next thing I have to learn on my instrument? Or, oh my God, what's he doing? You know, that it had all of these different sort of elements brought into it. You know, not only the music itself being so bigger, larger than life and fantastic, but I also did see them actually live too. And
that's one of my questions. You're anticipating. I was going to ask you, what was your favorite Led Zeppelin album? I love House of the Holy. No Quarter is my favorite song on the album. What's your favorite song on House of the Holy?
I love No Quarter. I love the song Remains the Same. I just think the whole thing sounds great. Like I think it's their best sounding recording as well. Best, you know, Eddie Kramer, who did the engineering for all of the Jimi Hendrix records, did most of the engineering on. He also did most of the engineering on Led Zeppelin 2, did House is the Holy. And to me, not only the composition's just amazing and each one takes you on a different adventure, but the technical recording of it, I think Bonham's drums sound the greatest they ever sounded on that record.
You said you saw Led Zeppelin live. That was another one of my questions. Which tour did you see?
I saw, you know, the tour that was essentially immortalized on the song remains the same movie. I saw that the tour that they did around Houses of the Holy, 73, 74, sometime around there at Cobo Hall. There's a funny story about that. People say, well, you have these conversations with Jimmy, and he remembers so much detail. Like, it's crazy for a guy that supposedly lives such a wild life. You would imagine that he would be like a little burnt out. I have to say that Jimmy's memory is extraordinary. And one time we were just talking casually, and this was many, many years later. This was like in the 90s sometimes. And Jimmy said, asked me if I'd ever seen the band live. And I said, oh yeah, I saw this tour. And he says, well, where did you see it? And I said, I saw it on Cobo Hall in Detroit. And then he goes, which night was it? So first, that tells me, he remembered in this crazy tour that he played Cobo Hall more than once. And they played 2 nights. And I said, I don't remember which night it was. I go, but I know, like, in the middle of the show, like, you and Robert did this whole extended, almost like a theremin, which is this electronic sort of instrument, theremin battle on stage. And Jimmy's like, oh yeah. He goes, that was the second night. He goes, because we came backstage afterwards, and Peter Grant yelled at both me and Robert and told us to never do that again. but this was 30 years later, and he remembered that they had played there 2 nights, and he remembered which night they had the theremin. Like to me, out of the hundreds of gigs that they played, that he could remember that, suggests something about his memory and his sort of brilliance.
How many times did you see them?
I only saw them the one time. They came back to Detroit again afterwards. They played the Pontiac Silver Dome, which was this gigantic stadium.
Right.
And I went there to see the Who play, and almost was trampled. And I was like, I'm never going to go back there again.
The days of festival seating.
Yeah.
So my brother Michael rubs it in my face that he saw. Of course, all of my siblings have seen Led Zeppelin, and obviously I was too young.
Yeah.
But my brother rubs it in my face that he saw Zeppelin during the tour for Presents.
Yeah.
Which I think is his favorite album. Achilles' Last Stand is his favorite song.
Yeah.
For $9.
Yeah.
Do you remember how much you paid to see Zeppelin for the Houses of the Holy tour?
Probably around that time. It was probably around $7. I mean, it was a different time, I mean, it was so funny because
it's ludicrous to think about seeing Led Zeppelin for $7.
I was born. I was still pretty young, like when Zeppelin was around. So when I saw them play, I was in 7th grade. I was in junior high. It was pretty young, but I would go and see shows all the time with my friends, and we would rarely ever buy tickets. We would just go to the place on the night of the show and buy them off the street. And back then, like you would say, I'm going to go take the scalpers. And now that means, like, if you bought the ticket from the scalper, you'd pay twice the price or whatever to get your ticket, or 3 times or whatever. Back then, it was always just a bunch of hippies hanging out saying, hey man, my friend didn't show up. Can you take this ticket off of me for $2 instead of $5? But that's the way I would do it. Yeah.
Staying in the theme of seeing Led Zeppelin live, seeing Page perform live, that was part of their strategy, especially in the United States, is putting on these 2.5 hour, 3 hour long concerts. And you talk to Page a lot about this in your book, that was something that separated them. I mean, the Beatles famously stopped touring, but Led Zeppelin went the other way. And that is, if you want the Led Zeppelin experience, you have to go to a concert. Do you think that was I mean, it apparently was, but a conscious, successful, dispositive decision on their part? Like, come get the whole experience and you'll leave a bigger fan than when you came.
Yeah, I think that. I mean, I think there were a few things. One is I think these guys just they like to play music, you know? Like if they were going to show up someplace, like why not play for 2 hours? You know, why not play for 3 hours? I mean, you know, if you're having fun and you're playing with you're one of the four greatest musicians on the face of the planet, you know, if and you're a musician and you enjoy making music, there's really nothing better that you know you're playing with all these great players in front of people who completely adore everything that you do. I mean, who wants to leave? Who
Yeah.
wants to leave that space? But to Page's point, he loved to improvise, and I think when they went to do the reunion tour, um, at first the idea was, well, we'll just do an hour and a half, and then we were like, well, wait. If we do an hour and a half, we'll only be able to play like 4 songs. People are going to be disappointed, you know. You know, Dazed and Confused would run 20 to 30 minutes in and of itself, you know.
You mentioned his name a little while ago in the interview, and I wanted to bring it back around to it because I've actually read a couple articles about him in preparation for talking with you, and that is manager Peter Grant. Yeah. He was either famous or infamous, depending on your point of view. But how important was Peter Grant to Led Zeppelin's success? And how did Grant's style of management, his emphasis on the band and the band's needs, change rock music and concerts and tours?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. It's, you know, you can look at Led Zeppelin's influence, and we've just talked about even aside from the music itself, like how they recorded their music, the actual recording process, how it's impacted music. There are so many things about that band that changed the music world, and one was how they were managed and how they were toured, and a lot of that was Peter Grant, their manager, plus Jimmy, who had ideas on how he wanted his band to tour and how he wanted them to be treated, you know. It's funny, but you still had, you know, the rock music world and the culture was shifting radically at that time. And in the 60s, you had a lot of the British invasion bands were being managed by these almost old school guys, you know, who really, you know, cigar chomping, like, you know, listen, kid, you know, I'm going to put you on the road, and you're gonna get a bologna sandwich, and you're gonna like it, you know, kind of.
And these bands weren't making money. I think in your book and your interviews with Page talk about the Yardbirds hardly made any money on their concerts and appearances.
Yeah, exactly. Because they were being managed by, again, sort of old school showbiz guys. And even in England, it was even more, it was even more rough and tumble, you know. There's a story, I'm going to blank on the manager's name. But anyways, there's basically a story about how originally Jimmy wanted Steve Marriott from Humble Pie to be the singer for Led Zeppelin, and you know, was planning on approaching Marriott, and Marriott's manager got wind of it and basically sent word to Page that, yeah, you can ask him to join the band, but not if you want, you know, still have your fingers the next day. You know, it was tough, and these managers saw the bands as being their property, and it was Peter Grant who really started seeing the bands as being the guys in the driver's seat and giving them that sort of respect. And I think Peter Grant just enjoyed the whole idea of that, you know, they were like pirates or something. They were they were out, they were ruling the world. They were making the record companies cower. They were making the promoters cower. They were just getting this money. They were just, and he said, like, I don't get it. Why should we that's creating the product make 10%? You guys make 10%. You guys are the ones that are going to do that. You're just marketing what we're doing. And of course, he was absolutely right. And went on to affect all sorts of managing and touring and recording arrangements.
And there's that beautiful picture that's taken with Led Zeppelin outside their airplane, which, today you kind of think, well, of course they had their own airplane. But back in the 70s, that was a whole nother level of superstardom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they were one of the first guys to really do that. But you know whose plane that was? Do you know the story behind this?
Isn't it in your book? Or I read it in a different article. I do a little bit, but you go ahead.
In my book, but I ended up working on some other project later, and I had so much fun doing it. But it was owned by Bobby Sherman, who was a teeny bop idol he was like a TV star, teeny bop idol during the 60s. He was in this TV show called Here Come the Brides, but he had all these just like he was the Justin Bieber of his day, so to speak. And he was the guy that came up with this whole concept, because he had to do these shows, and he had to do like a TV show, and he had to be doing concerts. So he had to bypass the whole commercial airplane thing. So he got together with his manager and said, let's just buy planes. Let's just do this thing. And we'll provide them for rock bands who want the same kind of thing. And so Led Zeppelin was sort of their guinea pig. It was they bought the plane, and then they went after different bands to use it. And Zeppelin was the first.
You talked about Peter Grant and how he changed things, but Jimmy Page, in coordination with Grant and the rest of the band, but Jimmy Page changed things in the sense of how the contract between Led Zeppelin and Atlantic Records was negotiated, the terms of the contract, how much control Led Zeppelin would have over their music. Jimmy was a big part of those negotiations and changing how contracts were written. You discuss it in your book.
Yeah.
Talk about it, please, for just a minute about singles and various other ways where Led Zeppelin exerted control over its own music.
So this was sort of the really interesting approach was this. So Jimmy, usually the way, and it's still to this day a lot of times like that, although maybe a little less these days. But usually the band got signed to would have a demo, or somebody would come and see them, and the band would sign to a label, and the label would give them X amount of money, and then they would go off and record their record, and then everybody sees sort of what happens. Well, Jimmy sort of knew what he had, and he knew it was great. And so what he decided to do was to produce the record himself. He put up the money for Led Zeppelin 1 and recorded the whole thing, and then took the final product to the record labels, knowing that once they heard it, they would just be blown away and would want it. And so he was right. They took it to a couple of different labels. They saw how good it was. They desperately wanted it. And that put Jimmy in the driver's seat, Jimmy and Peter Grant. And he was able to say, well, if you want this record, this is how it's going to be. I want to have, artistic control. I want to have X amount of, money and royalties. Here's how I want it to be paid. And of course, some of these people could have said no, but they heard what they heard on the Led Zeppelin 1 record, which nobody owned, in the beginning, was fantastic. And they knew that they were going to make money. So they acquiesced. Now, I don't think really Led Zeppelin necessarily changed that for artists. They probably woke some artists up to the possibility, but it didn't really change the music industry. It's just what Jimmy was able to get away with because of the obvious greatness of the band.
We have a few more minutes with Brad Tolinski, author of Light and Shade, Conversations with Jimmy Page. Fair to say that Led Zeppelin had a love affair with the United States of America and vice versa? And how important was the colonies to Led Zeppelin's success and its legend?
Well, I mean, it wasn't hard for Jimmy to see that, England was the size of one of our states. I think that they just looked across the water and said, holy cow, there's 50 of those on the other side. There's gold in them our hills, so to speak, So I think that they made it a point to really work the U.S. and to tour like crazy, because they knew that if they could break this territory, the money would come rolling in. And they were right.
Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page, and music critics. How would you describe that combustible mix? You read some of the critiques of albums like Led Zeppelin 2, which seems to me that's my favorite Led Zeppelin album, is Led Zeppelin 2. But some of the early reviews of it were just savage. And then, of course, 45 years later, Rolling Stone does it again and says it's 5 stars or whatever. Did the critics just not understand Led Zeppelin, or vice versa?
Yeah, they didn't. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And some are, again, you can't take these records out of the time that they were made. It's hard to see that time, because again, we're sort of 50 years, 60 years on. But at that time, the 60s attitude of, politics and the notion of musical purity and all these, and a bunch of other ideas were prevalent. And in the book, Jimmy says, look, the critics didn't understand us because they were still rooted in the 60s. And we were looking towards the next decade and what was going to happen and the part we wanted to play in it. And it's funny, he was, at the time, he was so confused that the music critics didn't understand what he was doing at the time. And and he was like, I don't get it. I mean, we're selling all these records. People are flocking to see us. Yeah. And yet we can't get any respect. We're like Rodney Dangerfield. But I think now, looking back at it, he'd say this, and I think he's correct, is that they were navigating the 70s, and most of the rock critics at that time were still sort of stuck in the 60s and with those types of attitudes and ideas.
Is it fair to say that Led Zeppelin and Jimmy and Robert Plant and everyone else seemed to just, and I read this in a John Paul Jones interview, that, and it may have been the one in your book, although I read a few more in preparing for this podcast, but that the band members just generally kind of got along. That so many of the bands, the bigger bands, they have this conflict, right? Keith Richards, Mick Jagger, Eddie Van Halen, David Lee Roth. I mean, the list goes on and on, right? But in general, it seems that the band got along well enough to create this music, and there weren't these gigantic ego-fueled tensions that some big bands have to deal with.
No, I think the beginning, it got along really well because basically Plant and Bonham were enlisted from the sticks of England. And it was such an incredible opportunity, and they were so thankful, of getting pulled out of the middle of nowhere into this band that was all of a sudden gigantic. that why on earth would they have any problems with
And
Jim
and I think it's a quoted. Forgive me. I think it's a quote in your book. I'm sorry, Brad, that you said that Page couldn't believe that Plant wasn't more famous. Like this guy, how is this guy not more famous? Forgive me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Page thought that there must have been something quote unquote wrong with him that nobody had him in a band already. Yeah. But then, as time went on, as it does, and egos got bigger and the drugs became more prevalent in the band, that things started to go a little bit sour. But, for their first, for the first 5-6 records, everything just sort of hummed along. It was really the drugs that derailed the band.
Led Zeppelin seems to have engendered its fair share of jealousy among its rock and roll contemporaries. There's a famous short clip on YouTube where Pete Townsend of the Who basically said, "I don't like anything they ever did," and he kind of confesses, "I don't know if that's because they're so much bigger than we were, but I like all the guys, but I just don't like anything that they did." Keith Richards says that to him, Led Zeppelin is just Jimmy Page. It's nothing else other than him. Well, how about that jealousy and Zeppelin's success, and not only its success but its impact, just the phenomenon that was Led Zeppelin?
Yeah, I mean,
these guys, obviously.
yeah, I think in the case of Townsend, I sort of believe I believe that him and the Who were so competitive. I believe that he couldn't even listen to what they were doing because it would just drive him insane, thinking about it. Daltrey, however, was a huge Led Zeppelin fan.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind hearing a Jimmy Page, Roger Daltrey record, by the way. That would be
amen.
Really, pretty interesting. Keith, he was coming from a sort of a more blues purist point of view. So I think to some genuine degree, felt like he didn't really like how they were sort of making the blues that he loved sort of this larger than life thing. I think he thought that was a bit of a violation of his blues purist ethic. So I don't know if it was entirely just jealousy, but I think, but there was definitely, everybody was in competition. Everybody was in competition. It was really funny. I was talking to somebody the other day. Who was I talking? I was talking with. I was actually talking with Kirk Hammett of Metallica, and I was asking him about like whether he felt competitive with, the other thrash bands or other
Sure.
Guns N' Roses or whoever they were, and he was like, "Yeah," he goes, "I don't want to admit it, but yeah, you're on the charts and you want to be number one. You want your records to sell better than anybody else, like that. I didn't want any harm to come to anybody."
Sure.
But yeah, we wanted to beat Guns N' Roses, or we wanted to, that kind of thing. And I totally understand it too, because recently my book came out, the Eddie Van Halen book, Eruption Conversations with Eddie Van Halen. And yeah, like I'm looking at the book charts, and you're like, well, I don't want anything bad to happen with Dave Grohl, but can't his book just like go away so my book can?
Well, there's an interview, and it might have been on the David Letterman when Zeppelin was on. I'd have to look it up, but the interlocutor asked John Paul Jones about, the competition between Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones. And John Paul Jones basically says, we didn't consider them competition.
Yeah. I don't think that's a flip answer, but I don't I think they were all I think they were all friends. Actually, the Stones and Zeppelin were pretty good buddies. but I think they also felt competitive as well.
As you were the editor of a music magazine, more than one, do rock fans just simply crave news about Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin? Can they just never get enough?
Yeah, I think. Well, here's sort of the brilliant thing, right? Like again, taking our conversation full circle, like this mystique that these bands, in the '60s and '70s have, the Stones and Zeppelin, and I don't know, for some people, Thin Lizzy or whatever it is, whatever floats your boat. Jimmy was smart. The other way he was smart was they only did so much press. Led Zeppelin did very little press. They didn't do that many photo shoots. They kept the idea of mystery, and even the occult stuff that we were talking about. Jimmy wouldn't play it up, but he wouldn't deny it either, because it just created more mystery. It created, a mystique sort of about what they do. And now nobody has any mystique, right?
Yeah.
Like, everything
bought
is
Crowley's house.
Everything is on social network. It's all here. It's all, but those bands, nobody really knows tons about them because they kept it quiet and media was different. So now they just want to know. Everybody wants to know everything.
Is that one of the driving forces for you writing this book, is to fill in some of those gaps?
Absolutely. And I would say for any of you out there that are Led Zeppelin fans, you should read my book above all others, because it actually has the most real information in it. Yeah, I mean, I'm coming from it from a different place than many writers come from. And I think it's reflected in my Eddie Van Halen book as well, is that I'm a bit of a musicologist. Like the drugs and the groupies and all that stuff, that's fun. And we talk a little bit about that. But to me, the music and its importance to the last 100 years and how great these guys were and what they were doing and how important it is for other musicians to understand it, was the driving force behind this book. Because Jimmy really hated to talk with journalists because all they wanted to know was the other stuff.
Yeah.
And he had really devoted his life to being a great musician, a great producer, a great songwriter, a great, all these things. And nobody was looking at that. And you can imagine how frustrating that is. I mean, arguably, Led Zeppelin is, easily one of the top 5 rock bands of all time. And one could say maybe the top 3, depending on who you're into, could be the Beatles and the Stones and Led Zeppelin, say, for example.
Right.
And there's been tons and tons and tons of stuff written about the Beatles analyzing the music and what they did in the studio. And the same could be said of the Stones. And Led Zeppelin never sort of got that same respect, even though what they did was more innovative because they did it all themselves. They didn't have an outside producer. They were doing it. Jimmy Page was doing it. And almost everybody was ignoring, well, how did you do that? How was that magic done? And so Light and Shade came out. It was, and it still is to some degree, one of the few places you can, actually find that out, like musically, why does it work? And I try to answer that. Jimmy Page recently released his own a book.
Yeah, but it's only a few of them, and they're enormously expensive, as I recall. Is that right?
Got a new one that he actually, I think, I think it's called Anthology or something. That is a cheaper version of those really expensive ones. And he's been sharing more. He's been sharing more in recent years on his own. I think for the last 10 years, like if you really wanted to know how Led Zeppelin records were made, you would have to buy my book and hear it from Jimmy talking about it.
Jimmy Page is universally regarded as one of the greatest guitarists of all time, especially in the field of rock and roll. Is he on your Mount Rushmore of rock and roll guitarists?
Oh yeah, no question. There are people that are technically better, but in terms of like compositions, right, songwriting, putting chords together, riffs together, and sheer volume of guitar sounds and scenery and vistas, or however you want to describe it, he's, it's him and Jimi Hendrix are like two of the guys that could not only play guitar but see where to take it and where it should or could go in the future.
Clapton and Van Halen and maybe Beck to make it a fiver instead of just four.
Yeah, I think Jimmy's a little different. I mean, I lump Jimmy together with Page together with Hendrix, because they were more than like amazing guitar players. They had this whole studio idea that was really cinematic in a way that those other guys like Van Halen, incredible player, Jeff Beck, incredible player. I have some other favorites that I like, but none quite had that total view that Jimmy Page and Jimi Hendrix had in the studio.
At the end of the last podcast we did with you, our first podcast with you about Eddie Van Halen, I asked you 5 questions that we ask of all of our guests. I won't ask you those again. So to end the podcast, you get a different 5 questions, and that is, give us, please, the Leaders and Legends podcast audience, your Led Zeppelin ultimate album side. 5 songs from, actually, of any of Jimmy Page's songs, including The Firm and other endeavors.
The Firm was good.
Satisfaction Guaranteed is a terrific song.
Yeah.
So what's your top 5 Jimmy Page songs?
Well, I'm going to go way back to the Yardbirds for at least one of these songs. The first track that he did with Jeff Beck, actually happening 10 years ago today. Is that how you say it? It's really such a great early guitar track. I think it was done in like 67 or something. And it has both Jimmy Page and Jeff Beck going to town on it. And it's a great arrangement. Love that. Then I will say, this is coming off of the top of my head. The thing that just jumps right out is the Lemon Song in terms of like guitar virtuosity, but also like the vibe of that song is so weird and dark and mysterious. It starts out with that gong and you're just on this weird, mysterious adventure. I think that's an amazing track. And of course it's got that great unaccompanied guitar solo in the middle of it, so that's way up there. I love The Song Remains the Same. I love that sound, that song. It's one of my favorite Jimmy Page guitar solos. It's got all those 12 strings. It's got all these, I also love Achilles' Last Stand. Okay, this is going to be a really long album side.
That's all right.
It's a lot long. So let's see. So that's 4. One more. Oh my God. I guess I got to make it good. I mean, everybody expects Stairway to Heaven to be in there. And it's hard to look at that song objectively, because we've all heard it like millions and millions of times. But
it is beautiful.
But every once in a while, I'll put it on I remember when my son was like turning 8 or 9, and I wanted to turn him on to some music. I just put on Stairway to Heaven, and I was hearing it through his ears, sort of, and I was like, wow, this is amazing, and that solo is beautiful, and the tones are so great, and the arrangement is so good. So I'll just, Led Zeppelin fans out there might groan, but I'm also going to put Stairway to Heaven on that list.
What's your favorite? Last question. I'll give you a bonus. What's your favorite live version of a Jimmy Page / Led Zeppelin song?
Well, I'll say this. So there's a famous Led Zeppelin bootleg called Blueberry Hill, and it is a great performance. And I think Jimmy was playing. I think his playing was on another level earlier in the band's career. Like, he was playing so much better. And I think as the band sort of went on, he became a little bit more about the show.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And about the looking good on stage as opposed to hitting every note. There's some pretty tough shows out there.
Yeah. You talk about, you're honest about that in the playing did change.
Yeah, the playing did change. But I mean, studio wise, I'll never really, it's very hard to critique Jimmy. I mean, he was pretty much on the ball whenever it came to the studio recordings, and the sound did change. And I don't know if I liked it better. In fact, I think his guitar sound got thinner. At one point, I called Jimmy out on that, said, how come, and he didn't really see it that way. Like, he danced around that subject that made me believe that he wasn't hearing it in the same way I was hearing it. He thought I was like, well, on this song, this sounds a little thin. And he's like, pretty healthy sound to me. There's only so much you could argue with Jimmy Page about his guitar tones. But I'd say like almost any live recording that you hear of the band through like 1972, 73 is going to be How the West Was Won is pretty good. I mean, Kevin Shirley did a great job engineering that record. It sounds like it's a good one too. But I'm more of a Zeppelin in the studio guy.
My favorite live is and it's very famous on YouTube, live version of the Immigrant Song, where they're playing in some like baseball stadium. I don't know if it's San Francisco or someplace, but it's absolutely perfect. Powerful.
Australia.
Yeah.
The Australian show you're talking about. That's 72, 73.
Everybody is completely and totally on point and perfect. Every instrument, plants wailing, just gorgeous.
Yeah. As it moves on, even Robert has has more vocal issues and stuff, but the band for its first 4 years was, certainly one of the greatest rock bands to ever walk the face of the planet. That's for sure. On stages.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends, LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest today has been someone who I can't say enough, quite frankly, Brad, for your kindness to come on the podcast. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Brad Tolinski, author of Light and Shade, Conversations with Jimmy Page. If you love music, if you love Led Zeppelin, if you love the 1970s, this is the book for you. It's wonderfully written. You will learn so much. and it's one of the best books I've read in a long, long time. Thank you, Brad, for your time today.
Thank you, Robert. Always a pleasure to be on.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.